This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hi there. Welcome to the show. I have Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos as my guest, as I do each week. And Eric, it's great to have you once again. I'll start with the customary pleasantries. How are you doing today?
Well, I guess I'm okay. I haven't gone radioactive yet, and here's hoping we won't tomorrow. Obviously, the war is back on, as if anybody's surprised by that. And I guess the question I've got is why and for how long? And nobody seems to have any answer to that.
Yeah, I know the news was talking about, there's the 10th straight day of bombing Iran. And it's like, tell me again what we get for this in terms of our freedom, our safety. I want to give the benefit of the doubt, but experience has taught me that really I can't trust the people in Washington, D.C. to tell me the truth.
Well, we know what we're getting. Gas is back up over $4 again. We had a brief reprieve for a couple of weeks. Now it's back to where it was. And I guess the worrisome thing, certainly for myself, is that it's possibly going to go a lot higher. I've heard that the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, is essentially close to running out, and that actually was the reason why Trump concluded the memorandum of agreement that's now defunct, because we were right at the point of, if the war didn't end, things were going to get really hairy with the world economy and with supply chains and all of that. Well, we're back to where we were. And now what? So if that's true, if we had been on the cusp of having an empty SPR in early July, where are we now? And where are we going to be in a couple of weeks from now? And what's the end game here? What's, ultimately the point of what's going on? It's been very evident that bombing the Iranians doesn't accomplish anything more than causing the Iranians to bomb us back. And I heard this morning, and again, we don't know because everything's so confused as far as what we're being told, but apparently there were at least 100 Americans that were injured and many more, and a number of them killed. They're kind of like seeping out after that attack on the facility in Jordan. And that's not a small thing. It's a pretty consequential thing. And now we've got the two things. We've got the gas prices up again, and now we've got American casualties are upping. How long are Americans going to accept this? Are we just going to sort of become like passive Soviets back in the 80s and just, well, we can't do anything about it. It is what it is. I hope not.
Well, on the bright side, though, I hear that the chocolate ration is being increased to 40 grams.
There you go.
So, we got that going for us.
Yeah. I hope that these maniacs aren't going to do something just completely out of control, like launch a ground invasion of Iran. If they do that, it could end up being a worse debacle than Vietnam was, and a faster acting debacle. It took 12 years to get 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. It could just take a couple of days to get thousands of Americans killed, invading Karg Island or wherever they're planning on invading. Also, another interesting aspect of it is that, at least at the moment for now, Israel seems to have retired from the war. Now somehow this war that was started basically for Israel, for the benefit of Israel, is now a war between us and the Iranians, which is an interesting thing. It's kind of a real life example of that old saying about how let's you and him fight.
Right. And which it has felt like that was the goal all along. And, now with Lindsey Graham gone, and by the way, isn't it interesting? Here this senator of many decades of experience and irreplaceable, champion of the American way. But his sister, who has no political experience, within 24 hours can replace him.
That's incredible. A heritable political office. Like, wow. They've done it before, didn't they? With McCain, when McCain died, didn't they insert, who was it? His family member, that his wife, I guess, assumed that role. That's a really fascinating thing, that, an elected office can somehow be transferred to somebody who has never been elected and really hasn't got the least basis for claiming to be the person who should hold that office.
It was questionable under the Bush dynasty. We saw the Clintons do some things that seemed pretty sus, in getting Chelsea set up for life. Liz Cheney, another example of, a little nepotism here. But, man, I don't mean to run down. I'm not running down the country, but I am definitely running down our government. I don't trust anybody at the federal level, with the exception of Thomas Massie and maybe one or two others that seem to be willing to suffer, for standing on principle.
I see a common thread here, and it's essentially something that Tucker Carlson touched on recently, which is that it's not just that they lie to us; it's that they hate us. They have contempt for us. The manner in which they behave reveals that they just think that we're just beneath any kind of respect whatsoever. Look what's going on with McConnell. I mean, they tell us, they actually have the audacity to tell us that, all that happened was that, he had a minor fall and he had a little pneumonia, but he's fine. We talked to him for 20 minutes. It's clear the man has got to be incapacitated. Just common sense tells you that if he's operational mentally, maybe he's in a hospital bed because he broke his leg or something. Well, if you're in a hospital bed because you broke your leg, you can still do a Zoom call, can't you? You could entertain some reporters in your hospital suite to say, hey, here I am. I'm on the phone with my colleagues in the Senate. I'm working on the public's business. Nothing. It's very clear that something hugely fishy is going on, that he's either dead or he's brain dead, or he's something along those lines. And we're also supposed to pretend that it's hallucinatory.
I read a wonderful article earlier this week, or I guess it was late last week, from Paul Rosenberg about restoring civil society. And he brought up something. I want to bounce this off you just to kind of get your reaction. Would you agree or disagree that there was a time where not everybody had gone into politics? In other words, a person could live a pretty normal life without having to buy into politics at all these different levels.
100%. Absolutely. We lived it, you and I. Politics was sort of on the periphery. It was incidental. During election season, sure, people, got into whoever it was that they were supporting for the office. But the rest of the time, life was normal. It wasn't constantly political, constantly ideological. Certainly at work, I remember going to work when, before I went on to work for myself, but you just worked. You didn't, align yourself according to whatever the political party was that you decided to align yourself with, separating yourself from the people who didn't align with that party. Now it's everywhere. It's saturated our culture. It's hyper politics. Yeah. And it's hyper ideology too. It's no longer even a reasoned discourse about your philosophical point of view about the proper role of government vis-a-vis the individual. It's this strident, almost religious, it has that quality to it, dogma that that you have to accept these tenets of the faith, so to speak. And if you don't, then you're an apostate. You're a horrible person. If you don't hew to the tenets of the faith of this side, and they feel the same way about the people on the other side. It's a form of psychosis. It's absolutely pathological.
There's a description here that Paul Rosenberg offers about how politics became almighty. Christianity and religion has pretty much been displaced, but he says, look, when everyone as a whole has gone into politics, we know what comes of it. He says it's a massive, arrogant political class that believes it has the right to govern every aspect of human life. And then you also have this atomized populace that fears everyone and everything and which recognizes no external point of reference.
Yeah, that's very well said. And it's very true. Politics now saturates so much of our lives that it requires almost people pay attention to it. Every person is a potential threat. Everybody wants to get into politics. What percentage of the population now is either in politics or government to one degree or another?
Right.
Probably something like half the population is in the government or in politics in some way. So, you create this awful feedback loop in which normal life has become kind of a quaint aberration, a relic of the past. It's almost like we're all becoming Amish in a way, you and me and the people who actually just kind of want to work and live our lives outside of politics. We're being pushed off into this kind of reservation like the Amish.
There's a question that he poses here that I think really illustrates how civil society was basically sent to the back of the bus. And the question is this: who do you run to when trouble comes? Because you and I are old enough to remember there was a time when civil society was still above politics, and that's when people would turn to their families, their friends, their neighbors. The community would rally when there was some kind of disaster or tragedy. But when politics overtook society, our trust was broken, and we were trained to run to the state for everything that troubled us. And of course, the state fed us, fears, real and imagined, to keep us coming back, to them for solutions. I'll put that in air quotes, solutions, to whatever was keeping us up at night.
Yeah, Albert J. Nock, in his great work, Our Enemy, the State, touches on that at length. And he compares, a sort of a loose aggregate society, voluntary interactions between people, as opposed to the state, which is corrosive because, you transfer your own moral responsibility to this government. And then instead of people being seen as your neighbors and your friends and people in the community, they become hostile threats, potentially at least. And this creates a kind of meanness in society. And you see this in every society that goes down this particular road. The suspiciousness, the distrust, the dislike, the automatic reflexive dislike of other people. It was characteristic of the Soviet Union. It was characteristic of East Germany. This is what you inevitably get, unfortunately, when you transfer what ought to be, the obligations of people to behave decently toward each other, to help one another when it's merited, and offload that to the state.
And that's the beautiful illustration here, is the things that we used to do to help each other out now are discouraged, or in some cases legally forbidden. I can't remember the guy's name. Maybe you remember this guy down in Florida, elderly man, arrested multiple times for the crime of feeding the homeless.
Yes. Yeah, I think there was a woman who did the same thing. She was handing out sandwiches to people that she'd made, homeless people. And again, they arrested her because she was in violation of some ordinance having to do with food safety,
Yeah, it's but here's the good news. If you want to help restore civil society, it does not require electing the right person or passing the right legislation or this or that, policy or ordinance. Restoring civil society is as simple as helping an old person carry their groceries, taking an old man to lunch, or watching your neighbor's house when they're out of town. Little stuff like that are the building blocks of a civil society. And I put this out there, again, hat tip to Paul Rosenberg for suggesting it. This is where you really start to reclaim that ground that has unfortunately been ceded to politics, and the politicians are trying to stand on and preen as if they're actually doing something.
Sure. And some of this involves self-policing, even on the relatively trivial level. For example, blaring loud, obnoxious music in a public area.
Yeah.
It's an incivility. To step back and think maybe other people aren't interested in listening to my noise, or talking loudly on your Bluetooth in a coffee shop where people are just trying to enjoy a cup of coffee, and they're really not interested in hearing what you have to say. And what ends up happening when people do these sorts of things, then the state comes in to correct the problem and applies a blunderbuss type solution to these things. Whereas if we would just learn to behave ourselves and not do these things, that wouldn't be necessary, or wouldn't be perceived as necessary.
Yep, I'm with you. And self-governance is how you, how can I put this, reduce the state's power over you. People who can govern themselves don't need some kind of external force being exerted on them, to compel, getting along with others.
Absolutely. And it scales. At the time when we had a civilized society, by and large, most people didn't behave that way. They were courteous. They held the door. They were, they maintained a low voice in public. They didn't act obstreperously, and they just conducted themselves by and large in a way as to facilitate and ease interaction, not create animosity and hostility. And we've lost that now. You see it everywhere. You go out into a public space, people are rude and obnoxious. Get on an airplane, get on any place where the public gathers, and it's a hellscape if you're a civilized person. And I don't know how we recover civilization until people on the individual level start behaving in a civilized manner again.
And I guess that's the key. And I think Albert J. Nock would agree with me on this one, his concept of one improved unit. If you are a source of benevolence, even if everybody around you is acting the jerk, you are still raising the quality of life for anyone who happens to be in your presence. And, it may not seem like much, but I would argue that is a measurable way of improving the world without imposing or requiring everybody else to dance, to your tune.
Another way is to acquire competence, to get into my little world of the car, learn how to drive.
Yeah.
Learn how to deal with basic problems that crop up, like a flat tire, or your exhaust pipe falls off the car while you're driving. so that you can deal with it, so that you're not helpless, and so that you're not hoping somebody's going to come and help me, i.e., the state. The more that you can become a master of things, the less that you're a slave to things.
Well said. Now let's pivot here. I noticed you had an article about why should it be illegal to text and drive, and I know that right there sets some people off. Their inner Karen. Yeah, their inner Karen is going to come right out. Well, of course, texting and driving is as dangerous as being drunk and driving. Let's make the case for why we cannot make a blanket statement that it's always dangerous to text when you're behind the wheel.
Well, because you can't make a blanket statement. This idea, the assertion of a risk, which may be valid, that there may be a risk, in my mind, does not rise to a sufficient warrant to treat it as an actuality. This idea that, well, somebody might, that's a bad doctrine, in my opinion. I prefer somebody did. If somebody causes an accident due to inattention or incompetence, by all means, hold them responsible for that, because they actually did something. It's pretty binary. It's pretty black and white. You don't have to debate whether the person was at fault or not. They were, clearly. So hold them accountable for that. What I don't like is this idea of holding people accountable for things that haven't happened, because somebody thinks that they might. The problem there, the real problem, is that it just gets more and more and more extreme. This drunk driving issue is a really good example. We went from having a standard in most states that was something, I think it was at one point 0.15. It was, you had to be pretty liquored up to be convicted of drunk driving. And generally, you had to have been witnessed driving erratically. A cop would be out and see you weaving all over the road. He'd pull you over. Then you find out that the guy's got a 0.15 or whatever. And, they're convicted of drunk driving. Now, you can literally have almost no alcohol in your system. And if you're under 21, you don't even have to have that. If you have an empty can in your car that was there for weeks, they can arrest you for drunk driving. It's kind of a reductio ad absurdum. And that's, I think, the inherent problem with this, because there's no end to it. How do you define it? Might is indefinable. Whereas what actually happened is objectively, there it is. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Yeah, and every one of those arrests on those technicalities comes with a complimentary lecture about the safety that is being, advanced in the community by, the state intervening and, taking you away.
In the case of the cell phones, it's really halting because of the fact that, what do cops, you ever look in a cop car? They've got a computer, a laptop, and they're constantly pecking away on their laptop while they're driving.
Or talking on the radio.
Or talking on the radio and not wearing a seatbelt, all of these things. Years ago, I got into a conversation with a cop about the issue of speeding. And, I said, how come it is that you pulled me over for speeding, but you speed all the time with impunity? And he said, well, I'm trained. I said, well, so am I. I've actually taken a number of high-performance driving courses, the same courses, by the way, that a lot of cops take, the DEA and the FBI take. I've taken those courses. I'm trained. I'm probably more trained than you. So how come I can't speed? No answer.
I asked that same question of a motorcycle cop in southern Utah, and the answer I got was, well, some people need to be sheepdogs, and that means we need to be able to do things that the sheep can't. Needless to say, that didn't go over very well.
Yeah. That's a really disturbing attitude to take, isn't it?
Yeah, it pulls the mask off, and it shows that we have a I guess you would call it a law enforcement superiority complex going on there. That we get to break the law, we can park wherever we want because we're here just to protect you stupid sheep who don't know any better.
Yeah, I mean, a theme that I have harped on for decades is the distinction between the old common law doctrine that you have to produce a victim for there to have been a crime, as opposed to this sort of case law doctrine that just because there's a law and the law has been violated, that justifies punishing people. That is the essence of totalitarianism. There are lots of laws in East Germany, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, lots of laws. Lots of enforcement of those laws, too. This is axiomatic. It's a self-evident truth. It's not an arguable point. So most people understand that a lot of those laws were pretty evil. How about in America? It was once legal to own people as slaves. That was the law. You legally had a right to own another human being. And if you helped a runaway slave, if you hid one, that was very much against the law. And you could be prosecuted. Isn't it not obvious that there's not necessarily a congruence between legal and right?
No, that's a beautiful illustration. Eric, we're down to the last couple minutes here. I'm going to ask you if there's anything on your radar screen, automotive-wise, that stands out and you feel like you'd like to share.
Yeah, well, we're now very close to the beginning of the 2027 model year. The 2027s are just beginning to come out. And as you may know, per federal requirement, the 2027 is the model year when all vehicles must have this distracted, drowsy driver technology, which effectively means a camera in the car that watches you while you drive and analyzes your eye movements and will parent you if it thinks that you're distracted or drowsy. And that's the first piece of what's going to be ultimately a driver control technology, the kill switch that people talk about vernacularly. That's what it will be, because ultimately when the car decides that you're distracted, you're drowsy, you're drunk, it will simply shut itself off probably, or pull itself over to the side of the road even. The technology, as they used to say in the opening to the $6 Million Man, they have the technology. It's being implemented piecemeal, to make sure that people don't get too agitated about it all at once. They just get them to accept this piece, then that piece, then this piece, and before you know it, you're in a pen.
Tyranny always comes on cat's feet, so
it does.
Keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
Again, great to visit with you as always. Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Look forward to our conversation next week.
As always, thank you, Bryan.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.